This House has an important question today on one of the most significant moments in world history. But before I get into that, thank you all for attending, and thank you to Mr. President for giving me this opportunity. The demise of the Ottoman Empire. Standing on the side of proposition, I want to make something clear, as it's often misunderstood. I do not regret the emergence of modern Turkey in any manner. What I regret is the chaotic and turbulent way the empire has collapsed. A collapse that led to widespread instabilities in the regions and communities that it once held together. And if anything proves how catastrophic the collapse was, it was the extraordinary rise of the Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the founder of modern Turkey. He did not rise because the transition was smooth or orderly. He rose because it was disastrous. And I remain deeply grateful to him for allowing us to still call Turkey home. But before I make the case against the fall of the Ottoman Empire, it falls upon me to introduce the speakers on the opposition of the debate tonight. Speaking first is Oliver Douglas, with whom I've spent truly unforgettable times in committee with, carrying chairs from the Gladstone Library to the Goodman Library and cleaning this chamber. Such unforgettable times. And for anyone thinking of running for Sakis or junior appointed, that's exactly what you'll do for 8 weeks. But going back to Oliver, he also attends every single CC meeting, unlike most of the committee members you see standing on those front benches. That said, he has not made a single contribution in those meetings so far. And for tonight's debate, I don't expect anything different from him. Now, even more interestingly, Oliver does a PhD in world history between World War World War II, British history, the exact period when Britain colonized Ottoman lands. So on paper, he is clearly well qualified for tonight's debate. Meanwhile, I had my last history class when I was 16. But judging by the side he's choosing to defend tonight, it doesn't seem like all those academic years have paid off. But we'll see. But in all seriousness, he's a brilliant historian and a great friend, and I'm excited to hear his speech tonight. Our third speaker is Konstantinos Philis, an expert in Greek foreign policy and a professor at the American College of Greece. He is also the lead director of International Olympic Truth Center and has a leading role in the Institution of International Affairs in Greece. Fourthly speaking, we'll have Hugh Pope, an author, editor, and former foreign correspondent specializing in Turkey, the Middle East, and Central Asia. And he has written for just about every major publication you can think of, including the Wall Street Journal, BBC, and the Los Angeles Times. So make sure not to say anything outrageous, please, at least tonight. He still have those connections to the media. And lastly, we'll hear from Kaya Genç, an Istanbul-based author and novelist known for his work on contemporary Turkey. His work has earned him recognition from many institutions, including the European Press Prize. Now, that's all we have on the side of the opposition for speakers tonight, and I welcome them all for the debate. The Ottoman Empire, hundreds of years ago, accomplished something even many modern democracies struggle with today. A practical system where communities with different backgrounds can live peacefully. Stretching from North Africa to the Middle East into the Southeastern Europe, the empire has governed people of many beliefs, languages, cultures, and religions together. The system allowed religious communities the right to manage their own schools, cultural institutions, and even their courts, their own legal systems, while remaining part of a broader imperial system. Of course, it wasn't perfect. There were power struggles and inequalities at times. But despite those flaws, it provided a country in which deeply diverse communities could live side by side. When the empire collapsed, however, it wasn't just the government that ended. It was an entire structure that had allowed people of different identities to be together that was gone. Without the governance of the empire, old tensions resurfaced, and those communities who lived together for years were now going into conflicts and were divided when faced with uncertainty. Let me now turn to the nature of the collapse itself and remind you that the fall of the empire was not a peaceful transition. It was chaotic, violent, and turbulent. In the immediate post-World War I period, the remaining Ottoman authorities lost control of many territories. Law and order was broken down entirely in some regions overnight. And people who were able to live together as neighbors turned on one another with aggressive nationalism. And the consequences of that breakdown extend far beyond the 1920s. Many of the ongoing tensions, unresolved disputes in the Middle East and Balkans we see today did not begin recently after all. They began after the collapse of the empire, whether it fits in the form of a civil war or a dispute over borders. It takes its roots from the collapse of the empire. If the collapse was not this turbulence, we could have seen a much more peaceful atmosphere for the last century in the Middle East and Southeastern Europe. But the consequences of the empire's collapse were not limited to internal chaos. What came next was arguably worse. When you ask someone why should an empire collapse, their most common response is that it will lead to freedom. When the imperial rule ends, you would expect that the people once it ruled would govern themselves within their own self-interests. But that's the exact opposite of what happened with the Ottoman Empire. The collapse did not bring freedom, it brought colonialism. Britain and France quickly asserted control over former Ottoman territories, not with promises of liberty, but through colonial rule. Agreements signed behind closed doors divided entire regions without consulting the actual people who lived there. From Iraq and Syria to Palestine and Lebanon, colonial administration took over, and new borders were drawn without regard for cultural or historical realities. A century later, we are still living with the consequences of those rushed decisions. So far in my speech, I'm mostly focused on the collapse of the empire and how it has affected many nations that lived under the rule of the empire. But when we turn back to Turkey itself, the opposition might argue that the fall of the empire was a necessary step towards the founding of the modern republic. But let me say this with pride and clarity. Turkey's emergence was not a product of the collapse, but it was rather a miracle in spite of it. After the war, the treaties signed by the Ottoman Empire aimed to dismantle Anatolia itself, handing over huge portions of Turkey land to European control. And that's when the Turkish nation, with the leadership of Atatürk, stepped forward. They rejected the agreements previously made by the Ottoman Empire. They fought for their independence. They forced the world to the table again, but this time on their own terms. The result, it was the birth of a sovereign republic. This success here was definitely not a natural step in the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. It was fought for and cannot be attributed to the empire's collapse directly. So in the end, what is it that we really regret here? It's not the end of the imperial titles or expensive palaces, not the fall of the dynasty either. Though as I say that, I try to avoid eye contact with Ayşe Osmanoğlu, a descendant of that very dynasty, hoping she still agrees with me right now. Not the rise of the modern Turkey either, but what we truly regret is when the empire collapsed, it collapsed into chaos. We regret that the fall led to a century of division and instability in Southern Europe and the Middle East, instead of leading to a smooth and inclusive transition. That is not nostalgia for the empire, but an understanding of cause and effect in an historical manner. And that is why I invite all of you to vote in favor of this motion tonight. Thank you.